Today's video has been sponsored by Likewise. Final Fantasy XVI is pivotal to the franchise. While Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy XV do have their fans, it's also no secret among the greater fanbase, there was certainly an abnormal amount of divisiveness on the quality of these titles, particularly when it comes to their story and characters. Final Fantasy VII Remake was indeed a massive success, garnering near universal acclaim from fans, and while it's taking some new twists and turns, it's not a fundamentally new Final Fantasy story, world, or cast of characters. For this reason, FF16 has a large task on its hands, creating brand new story and characters that we love just as much as the classics. And today, we'll analyze how they can do exactly that, by leveraging CBU3's other critically acclaimed game, Final Fantasy XIV, and how it can serve to make FF16 a better experience. But first, a word from our sponsor, Likewise TV. It can be a hassle to find your favorite TV show or movie when they're spread across so many different streaming platforms. Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, and a bunch others. But finally, there is a solution to this cumbersome process. Likewise TV introduces a free personal streaming hub that aggregates content from all of your streaming services in one place, and it's personalized just for you. No longer do you have to meticulously switch between a bunch of different apps to find what you're looking for. It's a single destination where you can access all of your streaming services in one place. You can finally have a unified watch list that makes managing all of your shows so much more convenient. And with just one simple search, you'll be able to find the show or movie that you're looking for regardless of whatever service that it's on. You can also connect it with social media and find out what your friends and favorite content creators are enjoying, meaning you can follow me and see some of my quality recommendations. So be sure to check out Likewise TV with the link in the description below. Starting off with what Creative Business Unit 3 arguably does the best in the entire video game industry: honest communication. This is something that producer Naoki Yoshida in particular absolutely excels at, and a huge part of the praise that he receives for his work on Final Fantasy XIV, and he seems to already be determined to bring that same spirit to this game. Video game delays are never a pleasant thing for developers to announce, nor for fans to hear. When Final Fantasy XVI was delayed, it was actually met with tremendous praise. This is because the team's statement was so transparent about how long it was delayed, and even the specific business circumstances that led to the delay. All of which is strikingly bizarre and incredibly rare to hear from any AAA developer in the modern age. Compare this to the lack of transparency with Cyberpunk 2077's delays, and you can instantly see why this is viewed in such a noble light. But this isn't a first for Yoshida or CBU3, as they have an insanely long history of doing this with Final Fantasy XIV, most prominently noted when Yoshida had to patch and fix the original game while working on a remake of it at the same time. As a result of the trying times of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, this form of open honesty has become the cornerstone of how CBU3 works as a studio. Isn't it funny how when you're just open and honest and don't lie to customers, they're actually really understanding about any situation and trust your decisions? Like how I honestly want you to click that subscribe button so we can get to 90K by the end of the year. Another huge thing to me is keeping the story relatable to real humans. If there's anything that FF14 excels at as a game that Final Fantasy XVI must have as well, is definitely its storytelling, which contrasts heavily with contemporary FF titles and a lot of other Square Enix writing. FF14 lore is filled with ridiculous and fantastical concepts like robot aliens, dragons who are also aliens, pudding way, whatever half Urianger says, and a lot more. These fantastical concepts are used to build humanity in the story. There's a famous saying that goes, "Fiction is the lie through which we tell the truth," and I can think of no greater example of this than Final Fantasy XIV. Things such as primal summonings are the result of men fashioning their own gods. By channeling ether, magic, into group fanatic belief, you can physically manifest the deity, but as a result of this radicalism, the god will temper, that is brainwash, the nearby populace to bend to its will. To contrast this, we have the Garlean Empire, who has made religion illegal to prevent the risk of summoning, and if you need someone to turn to in your time of need, you can worship the Emperor. While we can't summon primals in real life, it's pretty obvious to see what these things could be an allegory for. It's easily applied to real life. Square Enix has succeeded at this many times before with concepts such as the livestream, but it's been struggling in a lot of modern titles, and not even just Final Fantasy. The fallacy don't represent any sort of relatable concept to me personally. Is becoming a nobody in Kingdom Hearts supposed to be a sad thing? Because I literally have no idea how to relate to that. Becoming a nobody seems more like a minor inconvenience than any sort of real tragedy. I've come around to really enjoying Final Fantasy VII Remake. I find it to be a great game and can accept it for what it is nowadays. But one of my biggest criticisms of the story remains. So far, the arbiters don't represent anything relatable or anything about the human experience that I can tell. And if popular fan conjecture really is true, that it's simply about fans wanting the original to stay the same, then I have a really hard time empathizing and relating to that in any profound way. It really doesn't say anything about life beyond how I feel about just one video game in particular, which in comparison to the deep metaphors about the live stream, Shinra, etc., these concepts stretch out into meaning far outside of just the context of this game, leaving the arbiters feeling comparably shallow to me. Definitely will be reading some takes about my small brain take on that one. But in either case, Final Fantasy XVI should return the series to one that feels driven by the human experience, that is relatable to the human beings playing it. The next important lesson is world building, and the world building in FF14 is superb. Each location feels like it's there for a reason, and everything that exists in the world has a sense of purpose there in the lore, with a rich sense of history behind it. The politics behind the world exist not just to serve the narrative, but also the characters and their motivations. In contemporary Final Fantasy titles like Final Fantasy XV, locations often felt like a set of matching assets that were placed without any coherent environmental storytelling behind them. Final Fantasy XVI has over 6 different realms, and they need to have the distinction that Kugane has from Ishgard, and that either of them have from Razat Hans, so on and so forth. Locations vary from high fantasy to cyberpunk to steampunk, medieval, and other various genres of high fantasy. Make Final Fantasy XVI's world feel alive by having a ton of differing locales that each have their own unique stories behind them, and let that further enrich the player's sense of purpose for actually being there. Then there's the content that you find in that world, outside of the main story. Of course, I'm talking about side quests. This is something I cannot stress enough. Final Fantasy XVI needs side content that actually matters. Side content in modern Final Fantasy games has ranged from finding cats to, finding cats. In Final Fantasy XIV, much of the side content that you do actually matters. Not only do many of the raid series and many of the quest lines in the game explore the lore on a deeper level, if you actually complete this optional side content, scenes in the main story will adjust to reflect that you've completed this side content. You'll also have additional dialogue options for your Warrior of Light to reflect the fact that yes, that side content did in fact happen, and it was important to your character's development. I also think that when looking at titles like the Yakuza series or The Witcher 3, side content in role-playing games has tremendously evolved, and enriches the world in which those stories seek to deliver. It is time the single-player Final Fantasy games caught up to this notion, and Final Fantasy XVI is the perfect opportunity to do so. Of course, you can only be as invested in a world as you are its characters, and Final Fantasy XIV does characters exceptionally well, and in particular its villains like Emmett Selk and Xeno C.A. Galvus. These are some of the best we've ever had in Final Fantasy, and I would love to see that continue in FF16. I don't want to spoil anything here, so I can't go into too much depth, but I will say that the character arcs are some that have brought me to tears numerous times, something Final Fantasy hasn't done for me since I was a schoolboy playing Final Fantasy X. I want Final Fantasy XVI to achieve this again. one. And this one is the most important of all. Final Fantasy XVI should remember the spirit of Final Fantasy. This is something that I think Final Fantasy XIV does exceptionally well. This game goes far beyond just being loaded with references to previous Final Fantasy games. It uses previous Final Fantasy concepts like the Crystal Tower or Gunblades to build a brand new incredible lore. Final Fantasy's founding fathers like Hironobu Sakaguchi and Yasumi Matsuno have both expressed incredibly high praise for the game, including the fact that Sakaguchi himself never seems to long off of it. In fact, Sakaguchi's Twitter has basically turned into an FF14 stan account. I mean, literally, he just does not post about anything else other than this game, which tells me that this captures the Final Fantasy spirit. And I think that's the most important thing that any FF game could ever possibly do. But these are just my thoughts on it, and now I want to hear yours. Subscribe, click the bell icon, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And be sure to check out Likewise, link in the description below.